right. All right, so I think we're ready to begin. So welcome to our panel and welcome to all of our participants. We're very glad that you're here. This is the first of what will be a few policy panels by the Telecommunications Policy Research Conference. As most of you know, we've gone virtual for TPRC for at least the foreseeable future. And this just actually creates an opportunity to have some different kinds of dialogues. This is the first of those. My name is Mark Jamison. I direct the Public Utility Research Center and also the Digital Markets Initiative at the University of Florida. And I'm also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. It's my honor to be able to moderate this particular panel. Our focus here is going to be on how COVID-19 or how all the reactions to it are affecting telecommunications policy or ICT policy. We want to be able to think about the impacts on industry, customers, what are we learning, and what about us is we're going to keep the same or we're going to change forever. We have three really distinguished panelists to give us some discussion on this. All of you know these people, I'm sure, but I'm going to introduce them anyway just because it makes me feel good to do so. Let me start with Dr. Rosalind Layton. She's a visiting researcher at Aalborg University Center for Communication, Media, and Information Technologies, Vice President for Strand Consult, and she's a visiting scholar, a colleague of mine at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Scott Wallsten is President and Senior Fellow with the Technology Policy Institute in Washington, D.C. He's served as the Economics Director for the FCC's National Broadband Plan, served as an economist for the World Bank, and as a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. And then Professor Ellie No. He's the Paul Garrett Professor of Public Policy and Business Responsibility at Columbia University, where he's also director of the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. He focuses on the economics, management, policy of media, internet, and communications in the US and all around the world. He served with the New York Public Service Commission, on the White House Presidential Board on Information Technology, and on several private sector and NGO boards. So welcome, panelists. One of the worst things I can do is give long introductions. I've gone long enough, so let's just jump right into it. And let's start talking about network performance, the regulatory approaches. We want to figure out how have things performed, what's gone well, what's gone poorly, and also to throw into this, a lot of the regulatory agencies around the world have taken a different approach to regulation during this time. They've been more hands-off, have been more flexible in how they do things. What have we learned from that? So, Rosalind, you have written a lot on these types of issues. You're one of our world experts on it. So let's start with you. What are your thoughts on how this has all gone?
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you as well to our TPRC audience. It was so important that we could get to you through this online platform. And I want to thank everyone who registered today and all of our TPRC president, Nicole Turner-Lee, who's been leading this effort. So we're really excited about being able to go this way. We hope we get even more people. So, and thank you, Mark. So what I think this is this experience with the pandemic has been a great opportunity to revisit a lot of our conventional regulatory wisdom around how network owners behave under certain situations. And so, for example, an issue that we've studied very much in telecom policy, network neutrality, or internet regulation, this would be a great time to test. Does the network operator under this situation where we have a pandemic, people are confined to their homes, they have to use the networks, do we see the behavior that we were told would happen, such as blocking the network, degrading the connection, degrading the service, or also arbitrarily raising prices? I think that this has shown us over the 4-month period that, first of all, that has not only not happened to that prediction, but on top of that, the telecom operators have done the opposite. They've actually offered free service. They have extended they've added more sites. They've added more wireless capability, more Wi-Fi capability. They have offered not to cut the service. They've extended for those who cannot afford to pay or they have late fees, that has been waived for a 90-day period. And in some cases, if you look at Internet Essentials from Comcast, if I'm not mistaken, that some programs have been extended through the end of the year with these additional conditions, making them more available. So this is an interesting moment because precisely when the regulators are not at their posts, they're working from home or they're not being able to surveil or oversee the networks in the same way, we don't see abusive behavior. And I would argue that we're actually, this is not just telecom networks. We've seen in other utilities, in the rail, transportation networks, all of them are utilities, electricity, all of them continuing to offer the services, maintain the deliveries and so forth. So I think we need to revisit the typical assumptions that we make when we want to have, these regulatory policies, that in fact, it was the right thing to do to restore internet freedom in 2017, because that has been assured the network operators the ability to invest. And it's been important that the investments have been made because it's allowed us to endure this particular extended period of being on the networks. And I think that has been, to me, that's really the biggest lesson. There are others, but that ability to see that the network incentive, the market incentives that the network operators have to invest in their networks, they have not reneged on those. They stayed with them, and they haven't, given the opportunity, they did not harm their customers or the service providers, the content providers of the networks.
All right, well, thank you, Rosalind. And my apologies to the audience. I failed to explain our format. I'm going to be asking questions of our panelists for about 45 minutes. The last 15 minutes will be for you to ask questions. If you have questions as they come up, please put them into Q&A. You'll see that on the bar, probably on the bottom of your screen, maybe on the top, depending upon what software or what device you're using. So, so please do that. And let me get some other thoughts on this. Ellie, you look like you're ready to talk, so let me ask you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. And Rosalind, I agree with virtually everything that you've said. But I want to extend that. First, kind of, there really have been amazing things happening. People have been using their internet data capacity by more than 85% increased, mostly due to video, but also due to other applications. And if you think about it, suppose this pandemic had happened 25 years or so earlier, what would we have done? You couldn't really work at home. You couldn't really educate from home or to the home. The entertainment was more limited. The shopping, the e-commerce aspects of it, we would have been in telemedicine. We would have been in truly deep trouble. But now we do have major abilities to function. So thank you very much for the internet providers. However, that all said, we also have to observe that there's still some pressure points left. First, in some countries, things have not gone as well. Those are mostly the countries, I believe, where the internet is provided mostly by mobile, that is by smartphones, and that means that the capacity cannot be increased in the same fashion. Those countries have experienced more slowdown than other countries, which suggests that infrastructure, wireline infrastructure, is still important. Secondly, Wi-Fi in homes where use cheap or old Wi-Fi routers, the throughput can be low, and therefore if multiple people are using it, multiple students, for example, multiple entertainments, there has been congestion issues. Not network issues, but for the consumer, it doesn't seem to make a difference. There have been problems with the economic foundation of media because of the advertising problems, and ultimately the economics drive the business model, and so we have problems in a whole number of reduced advertising. For example, national cable down 16%, broadcast down 14%, and newspapers in April at least down by 30%. And so you can imagine that the long-term implications on media. So it's not just a technical throughput, but it's also an economic flow. There's been pressures on new content because we couldn't really produce new content, and that will also translate itself into consumer demand for content. We have experienced problems and pressure in the supply chain, partly due to China, on components, on devices that have indicated also vulnerabilities. And those are issues in 5G, for example. That's an issue in Europe that would suggest some problems in the future. Cell sites, upgrade of cell sites to 5G is encountering public opposition in places. It's not so easy. There's been that myth around that somehow it is conducive to COVID-19. And so therefore there have been in multiple countries, including in such an enlightened country like the UK, there have been many cell sites being burned by people, neighbors enraged at the potential health problems. And lastly, we also have to deal with the question of emergency capacity, standby capacity for emergencies. The way that networks are constructed is for kind of general use, not for special and peak type usage, as might be the case in the current situation or in future emergencies. And the question is, how would we provide such a cushion for future emergencies? It doesn't seem like something that companies on their own would easily provide. It's not economical, so there must be some regulatory or subsidy mechanism that would, or the ability to use some governmental spectrum in an emergency that would be established. So that's a policy question to raise.
All right, very good. Thank you, Ellie. Just to put a point on something you'd said about about the role that ICT plays. You know, what if this had happened 20, 30, whatever years ago? A postdoc and I did research just recently on how valuable is ICT now versus just 3 years ago. And it's a 6-fold increase. And so it's played a critical role. That's a really good point. Scott, from your vantage point, chairing a think tank in DC and other work that you do, what are your perspectives on how things have performed, what we've learned from that?
Right, well, I agree with what both Rosalind and Ellie have said, and we've seen the networks have performed remarkably well in most places around the world, not everywhere. But some of the things that I think this may cause us to rethink now are, for example, some of the metrics that we tend to pay attention to with broadband. So, for example, policy and most of the ISPs themselves and consumers and so on focus very heavily on speed in terms of megabits per second, right? And that hasn't been a constraint at all in this case. I'm sure for some people with very, very slow broadband, it has been in rural areas and so on. But for the most part, we just haven't seen an issue with that. But people may now care more about other things, like latency, for example, because now at home, we're involved in more real-time applications. And for real-time applications, the speed that it takes to interact with somebody for the bits to go back and forth matters an awful lot. And you can get a sense of this even just on Zoom. If you go to your preferences and look at the statistics, you can see that you're probably using about a megabit per second for this. So, when you see that you're doing some video a megabit per second, well, does it really make sense then to be worrying if people get a gigabit per second? That's probably not our policy concern. But if everybody's at home, you want to be able to talk to your doctor in real time. You want to be able to do all of the things that you would normally do in an office in real time. And we haven't really optimized the networks for that. It just hasn't been. It just hasn't been the biggest issue. And I'm not saying that necessarily it's a problem, but it may be the kind of thing that we want to focus on. And I think that also should cause us to question some of the issues around net neutrality. And Rosalind talked about this a little bit too, but the phrase fast lanes always had a really bad connotation. But now it's easy to imagine why you might want that. Again, talking to your doctor, talking to your therapist, you want a clear connection that doesn't drop out and isn't interrupted. and you could imagine wanting to be able to pay a little bit more for those kinds of connections at certain times, or the doctor's office might want to be able to have that kind of connection. You might want schools to be able to offer that to their students. And so you can see, where the uses for this for this might be. And it's been harder in the past, I think, to imagine scenarios where it was so relevant. And now I think we can. That doesn't mean that the concerns that people have made, that people have worried about, are irrelevant. It just means that the benefits from something like that are much more apparent. And I think it's going to be something that we should be thinking about more seriously in the long run, or next.
So Scott, you mentioned education.
Mm-hmm.
And two of the big adaptations we've had to go through is working from home and going to school from home. And I'd just like to zero in on the education aspect. So from your perspectives, as we've gone through that transition from physical school to virtual, what's gone well, what's not, and what have we learned along the way?
So if I'll just start to continue what I was saying before. I think mostly it's been a disaster for everybody. It's been a disaster for teachers, for students, for families. I can't think of anybody who thinks this has gone well. I'm sure somewhere in the country or in the world it has, but we haven't seen it yet. So I think there are a few things that we should be learning from this. One is, and this is sort of a little hobby horse of mine, that we've now had thousands of simultaneous experiments going on around the country and around the world of schools really trying anything they can to get their distance learning up, and also to deal with digital divide issues. Giving Chromebooks to students, giving hotspots to students, anything they could think of. We haven't collected data on that. What did schools do? We should have been collecting data. This was a natural, it's not, well, so it's kind of it's more or less an experiment, obviously with weird demand conditions, but an experiment of what might work and what didn't. And as far as I can tell, nobody's systematically collected that information. It could have given us so much knowledge about ways to deal with the digital divide, ways of doing different kinds of distance learning. And as far as I can tell, nobody cared. Not the FCC, not the Department of Education, nobody. We're willing to spend billions and billions of dollars more on digital divide issues and universal service, but we're apparently not willing to spend even the tiniest bit of money to build a database of this, and it bothers me.
All right, so anybody else want to chime in on that? Ellie?
Yeah, first I do agree with Scott totally that it was a disaster. I would add, perhaps there was one big fucking disaster.
That provides a lot of clarity. Thank you.
Okay, so and why? Because it was, I mean, there were school districts and they all tried, and many tried very hard, and some tried much less. And it is, according to at least what I've seen, it was not a resource issue. And so it was an issue of institutional inflexibility. It was an issue of inability to lead. It was an issue of inability to bring in your own technology staff or to use that of other school districts or states. It was an issue of union contracts, of teachers who did not want to do things in a different way. There was a whole range of institutional constraints. That was the issue. And all this is somewhat hiding behind the digital divide issue, which is legitimate, has to be done. There's some initiatives too, and the Multicultural Media, Telecom, and Internet Council and about 25 other groups are really working hard in order to close that gap. But the gap is not the only explanation, and we should not wrap ourselves in saying, oh, because we have this problem, we cannot kind of solve anything else. We have to do all these things simultaneously. And so the institutional constraints, and they are really almost criminal. Preliminary research suggests that students nationwide will return to school in the fall, if they return in the fall, with roughly 70% only of the learning gains in reading, so 30% less, and less than 50% in math. In other words, they have kind of lost almost half a year because the school systems were not able to organize themselves. It's not just money. Half of the school districts in the country don't even know whether students participate. Half of the school systems in the country do not keep track of students' performance and how much progress they're making. Now, if it would be 0%, then might be a technical and sociological type issue involved. But if half of the school districts are able to do so, what about the other half? Why can't they do that? And what is their responsibility to their students? And so I think that if you kind of look at all of the impacts that there are, plus the impacts that students sit at home without the enrichment of being able to visit outside, to go to museums, to do all kinds of other stuff. If you add it all up, we are basically condemning a whole generation of young pupils to be behind, not only academically, but probably also emotionally. And we cannot afford to do this in another school year again.
So Ellie, let me follow up on your answer, just to ask you to take another step. So there are social media platforms, or internet platforms in general, are playing big roles in providing information, especially during this critical time. People are trying to figure out what could they believe, what could they not. But that's been true for a while. We've seen it in politics, we've seen it in a lot of other dimensions. You've commented before that we put these internet platforms in untenable positions of trying to be both purveyors of truth and sitting in the middle of great controversy. Could you just expand on your thoughts on that, please?
Well, sure. I mean, everybody's very excited, and lots of crazy people are saying crazy things. So Woody Harrelson goes around and he thinks that 5G towers are at the root of the problem. Okay, now the question is it the responsibility of Facebook or whoever to basically to block such, in their opinion, untenable positions? Well, if you look at it more carefully, there are people, lots of people, including the FCC and OSHA, who do believe that radiation has an impact, which is why there are some limitations on RF radiation. So it's not coming out of Mars that there are some health impacts of radiation. Now the question is whether it applies to 5G, and almost certainly it does not. But you cannot simply in a way make Facebook ultimately like the EPA of society, end of the world, or of the Food and Drug Administration approving or disapproving certain positions on health. And so we're actually expecting too much from these companies. And we're also totally contradictory. On the one hand, we complain, and rightly so, that these platform companies have too much power. And they have too much power because in some ways, the economies of scale and scope and network effects and distance, and there are some fundamental economic reasons why they're powerful. So we complain, but then we want them to do more. And we end up leaning on Facebook and others to clean up their act. And so Facebook is now employing, or through subcontractors, by numbers that I read, 15,000 content moderators, which I think is the current euphemism for censors and controllers of content. That's probably more than the Chinese government, and certainly more than in the future, because the demands on the company are growing. And so the question really is, how do we deal with this? It's legitimate to expect that criminal content, criminally defined, such as burn down this cell tower, and do it now, those imminent type issues is criminal, and therefore Facebook should try as best as it can to keep it down. But if somebody has a crazy opinion and a wrong opinion and even a lying opinion, I'm not sure if that is the role of a private sector company to do. There are better solutions to it. One of them, of course, is to reduce the market power so people have choices. But an even better solution, I think, is to permit access to give users the opportunity as well as responsibility to connect and interconnect through APIs, application programming interfaces, and have companies, commercial companies or private nonprofits, as intermediaries to do the screening for consumers and users based on the instructions of those users. To screen and to select and to recommend and to do all kinds of things, so that it is not just one giant company that basically makes those decisions for you but you as the user can have the tools to make the decision for yourself and the responsibility for yourself.
Okay. Rosalind or Scott, do you have some thoughts on that?
So I would like to say one of the things that this pandemic has helped us give some perspective. We have had a long discussion about the online privacy debate and legislation, and all of across the 50 states, different states are taking on their own privacy rules. And I think that this pandemic has, at least in the same way that net neutrality has, is that we have, I would say, a more nuanced view of the importance of platforms. So I think Ellie has made some fair points. But what I would say is push back a bit on this binary view that, you know, all platforms are bad or too big or whatever. It's extremely valuable that we can have these platforms to provide information when we need it, emergency information, that it's accessible immediately, that you can get particular things that, you know, that you can get what you need. And also, a lot of the companies have stepped up to help the federal government to track and trace. They have taken it upon themselves to help facilitate a lot of the learning that we need to know. So we have also brings us back to really the historical view of privacy in the United States, which was a shared responsibility between the user and then the entity collecting the information. So today, maybe since the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, it was very much a fundamentalist view that privacy is a property right, and it's indivisible, and so forth, and that it has to be only one way. But we now can see that there are situations where it's valuable for platforms, the government, other entities to have the information to be able to use it, and that we can't look at it as a sort of individuated situation where you can't have my privacy at this moment, because there are collective health concerns that we have, and how our behavior may affect others, how their behavior affects us. So it has had an impact in the policy field at the federal and state level to push back a bit on the view that every single privacy right can be fought in court, it can be litigated, that we're going to chase after tech companies to get revenue from them because they collected this privacy and information in a certain case. So I think that we have to have a more nuanced, holistic view around the value of platforms, the value that they bring to society. It's not perfect, but think going back to, as Ellie said before, 25 years ago, how would we have liked it not having a search engine that worked as well as it did, or the way that we used Facebook to check in with friends and family. Are you safe? Are you in this situation? Disaster and emergency preparedness and so on. So I think that we have to be fair that they have played a valuable role to help us endure through this difficult time.
That's interesting, Rosalind, talking about I might have a private value of kind of withholding information about me from other people, but there are times when needs to know for a society in general or for government or whatever could be quite large. Scott, you've done a lot of work on privacy and the value of privacy, mechanisms for that. What are your thoughts on this topic of privacy?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question and issue. So Jeff Prince at University of Indiana and I did a paper recently. We're trying to estimate the value of different types of privacy, or privacy for different types of data across countries and across platforms. And one of the things that popped out was very clearly that Germans had much more of a preference for privacy than just about anyone else. And I don't think that surprised anyone. That's sort of what we believed before, and you saw pretty clearly. But now looking at COVID, it's interesting to note that Germany is one of the countries that embraced contact tracing, and people had to give up much of their location privacy when they're tested positive. So, I think people even where they have a more naturally strong preference for strong privacy rules, understand that there are trade-offs. And in this case, it appears, I don't know, all of the details what happened in Germany, and obviously institutions and the arguments and the various forces on different sides matter a lot. But they were willing to compromise on this very strongly held belief because they saw that the benefits could be so large. And I think that that's true generally. I don't think policymakers will acknowledge that tend to acknowledge that nuance about privacy, and people do. Individuals recognize that, and some people value their privacy very, very highly, and it's going to take a huge benefit for them to give it up. Other people see what they're getting in exchange for it. And those can differ across people and across countries, but I think people are much more rational than we give them credit for.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions over in the Q&A, and we're not time for that yet, but there are a lot there. So I'm going to ask one more question. Ellie, I'm going to ask this of you, then I'm going to jump over to the Q&A. So Ellie, in talking with you before, you've described that we're in kind of, that we could view our time horizons in COVID and ICT in kind of 3 layers, and that we're at an inflection point. I'm not sure I can describe it much better than that. So how do you describe it? Tell us what you're talking about.
I will do so, but can I address the privacy issue for just one moment?
Okay, for one moment, yes. Right. Then get to the bigger question.
Which is, yes, privacy has to be relative to the context. And I think everybody's agreed with it, except possibly some postmodernist scholars who kind of, in this particular instance, are absolutists. That said, the question really is whether these restrictions that we're now talking about, or the tools such as particular contact tracing, whether they really work. So it's not just kind of, it's easy to talk about, in principle, we should kind of abrogate some privacy, but are we abrogating it for something that is useful? These tools work only, people have kind of analyzed this, when about 60% of the population uses it. No place does 60% voluntarily sign up to these tools. The only way to do this is kind of like in Europe, they're less than 30% or 30%. I think Iceland has, where Rosalind has, about 35%. So the only places it works is like in China, where it's mandatory, or in Israel, where you have a private system, which is kind of relatively undersubscribed, and a kind of in a governmental security intelligence service type system that was already in place that is now being utilized, where nobody has a choice anyway. And these things do not work very well, which is why Norway has opted out, why the UK wants to opt out of these, because they do not work. Even if they track people, they end up tracking people who live across in another apartment on the other side of a wall, because the Bluetooth kind of penetrates, or where there's absolutely no connection. So people are being traced and tracked and warned and quarantined without any particular benefit to society. And until these technical issues are being resolved, it's a little bit of a virtue signaling. Governments, yeah, we're doing something about it, but it does not really work. And so then we are stuck with a system, just like after September 11, where the immediate crisis leads to an immediate imposition of restrictions, and these restrictions never go away. So now to your question, which is much briefer to answer. The first phase, it's a bit like Maslow's type hierarchy. The first phase is the immediate problem. You have to deal with safety and health and security and children, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we've done this really well with ICT, kind of with exception. The second is more the intermediate level, which is how are behavior pattern changing. People do different shopping, they work differently, and they're not going to go back. It's a bit of a tipping point, when at a certain point, it was the exception to sit at home and work in your t-shirt because everybody was in the office or in the factory. But now the exception is to put on a coat and tie and sit in front of, or kind of go to an office like in the old days. So behavior patterns change. That gives to researchers and to policy analysts really interesting questions to analyze. But I think that in some ways the most interesting one are the long-term implications of some of these things. As entertainment media change, as content changes, as the way in which we deliver health, say through global health corporations, private sector global health or public sector global health corporation, all kinds of, in which money changes, in which monetary policy changes. Those are kind of interesting issues, and I hope that TPRC, this is the community. I like to think of the C as a community, not just as a conference, that TPRC scholars should kind of really look into it, because in some ways, the first immediate issues are those that can be dealt with on CNN and MSNBC, et cetera, every night, all the time. And the second one are policy analysts and consultants and so on. That's also, and researchers, marketers and so on. But the third one are truly kind of scholarly contributions. And it is our opportunity as well as our obligation.
All right, well, thank you very much, Ellie, I appreciate that. So let me now go to the questions that we have in the Q&A. And Roz, I'm going to start with you. It's a question about radio spectrum, and I know you've spent some time thinking about that. So the question is there a need to kind of rethink how we currently manage radio spectrum, given what we've learned with COVID-19? In particular, this questioner is interested in, can we have some novel approaches like commons or different uses of property rights? So what are your thoughts? What are we learning here? What can we do better?
Well, so thank you for that question. I absolutely think, yes, it's a time to review how we manage spectrum, particularly federal spectrum. And we have to review it anyway, because we've been doing it the same for 98 years. So what is, more than half of our airwaves, the primary users are the federal government. And this has never been optimal. It hasn't ever really been reformed. So I think the real question today is, what is the social cost for us to maintain the way that we do it? And as an economist, the bigger picture here is for those who suffer today because they don't have adequate access. We have made decisions around who gets the access to the spectrum. How do we allocate it, right? Is it going to be a licensed? Will it be unlicensed? Will it be even available for private users or not? And I think we really should, if we think hard about this, we could have enabled 5G access to rural areas. We have the capabilities to do this, but there are vested interests that aren't excited about having next generation wireless access to everyone in America. There may be wireline interests that prefer that it's delayed. And I think that we can look at the dangers of that policy and that those who suffer today. So the interesting thing here, this is not a technological limitation. These are political limitations that are forestalling our capability to have everyone enjoy in the networks. We see in front of us that different technologies are reinventing themselves. The different operators are using different technologies and coming together. It's very exciting. If we look at the federal government, itself wants to take advantage of next generation technologies. And some countries have started using fees. This is not something new. Ronald Coase talked about this in the 1950s. It took us a long time to start doing the first auctions just for the licenses. So I think that there's still a lot of work to do in telecommunications policy on spectrum. And this is a great time. It was a great time before the pandemic. It's an even better time now to be looking at this, because it's also about our society. And do all of us get to enjoy wireless networks, or are we going to reserve it for those particular agencies who are part of particular institutional arrangements where they can ensure for themselves the frequencies, when we also need to worry about we need to allow new technologies to come to the fore. And particularly, I would say, who could take most advantage of wireless technologies today, not just children as school children, but the elderly, people who are experiencing particularly unique situations. They have special health needs, hearing challenges, physical challenges, that where wireless networks in particular can play a role for them, the devices that they use. So it's really about, we can look at the one hand, we can spend hundreds of billions of dollars to keep building networks in an old way, or we can also say, are we going to be smarter about technology? Will we be smarter around how we allow the spectrum to be used? I will say on one bright spot, which is very exciting right now, the CBRS, the 3.5, I think over 300 parties have signed up to participate in that. That is Navy radar spectrum. It's very little used. The Navy uses 1% of that. 99% is available for private users in a tiered access model. That's a tremendous accomplishment that's been enabled through new technology. So those are the sort of things that we need to action. The FCC is moving forward on that. There are many other things on the horizon that are, in play now where we need to get more spectrum. But the big issue is definitely federal spectrum, because that is more than half, and we don't have a lot of transparency about it. It's been managed the same way for 98 years, and it's time to take a look at it.
So let me build on that. Yeah. Actually, one thing I might add to what Rosalind said, that federal agencies, the federal government is not the primary user of the spectrum, but the primary holder of it, and that they don't use it well or efficiently, and that's part of the problem, which of course is what you were saying. But I think so. Two things. One is on that part, they're the largest holder of the spectrum, and I think we're moving in the wrong direction on that. We've seen federal agencies jumping into debates directly themselves about where spectrum should be allocated in ways they really didn't used to. You've got the DOT arguing for what they call the auto spectrum. You've got other agencies trying to keep Legato from operating its network, and so people really they have this they sort of feel ownership of the spectrum, and do what they can to keep this from changing. And without sort of central, without someone keeping the agencies under control, this just gets worse. And I think we're heading in the wrong direction now after making some progress. The other thing, it's actually a point I think somebody made at the beginning, how we think about emergency access to spectrum. The pandemic has created something different. The way we think about emergency access normally is that there's some emergency and you've got all of these first responders who need access to the spectrum right away, and possibly lots of it, because you've got people transmitting lots of data back and forth, possibly in a very small space. And we've dealt with that with things like FirstNet, where they can get priority access to it. But in this case, it's a little bit different, right? Because it's everybody who needs more access, not the emergency responders, because they're not the ones who need more access at a given time. It's people who are at home and using the internet using wireless as their main internet source, for example. And that's why wireless companies were given the opportunity to use additional spectrum that's not yet been licensed to take care of that. And we didn't have a good way to handle that because this is so unusual. And it seems like it was a good decision that the FCC did, and it relieved some congestion. I guess the question is whether we want to have more established ways to think about that sort of thing in the future, or if we just decide, hey, this is really a once in a lifetime thing, and we handled it okay, let's just move on. I'm not sure, but it really is a different kind of emergency situation.
Yeah. Ellie, you brought up that topic of the emergency situation. Do you have anything you want to add before we move to another topic?
Yeah, I think just to echo Scott again, which is that the allocation of civilian versus governmental has to be seen as fluid. That obviously some of it has to stay. Air traffic control frequencies cannot become suddenly civilian, but there's a lot of spectrum that can move back and forth according to needs. So there could be primary users and secondary users. And that also means that some of the cell phone frequencies or broadcast frequencies at times could be commandeered in a war situation for national security purposes. But I would say more generally, this COVID is a major crisis, and one should not waste a crisis. The crisis made it possible to think in new ways and to implement things in ways that in the past have taken years and years. In the medical field, suddenly the government has made it possible to practice telemedicine, to get reimbursed for telemedicine, to have doctors practice telemedicine across state lines, and who knows in the future across international boundaries. So there's a lot of things are changing. In spectrum too, we should have an open mind. I've advocated for a long time that we should have spectrum, not see it as like land that you kind of sell a piece of land, but rather as an access issue where you pay an access fee like on a highway, a toll booth, and that parts of the spectrum should be open but not free, unlicensed but not free in a financial sense. And we could kind of use this now possibly to implement some experiments and introduce such a thing.
All right, well, thank you very much. So I'm gonna go back to an issue that some of you raised earlier, and that is getting the broadband deployed to people that don't have it. And I guess in a lot of instances now, especially in developing countries, companies have, the operators have deployed broadband, but the customers aren't paying for it yet because they can't or don't, or whatever reason that might be. So one of the questioners comes at us from that direction. And it's talks some about the different ways that we've tried to fund universal service, but asked specifically about developing countries. And the question is this: it's especially in developing countries where there's been more experience providing supply side subsidies to foster development of infrastructure. Demand side subsidies would be a totally new approach. And in times of an urgent need to connecting people, what do you think would be more effective for budget constrained developing countries, and they all are, where they're trying to close that digital gap? Should it be supply side, subsidize the supply of it, or demand side, subsidize the person doing the purchasing? Scott, you've worked on that. Let me start with you.
Yeah, so I've done work on telecommunications in developing countries, particularly earlier in my career when I was at the World Bank. And of course, the first thing to say is that institutions matter a lot. So, making broad statements about, developing countries or industrialized countries is dangerous because the details matter an awful lot, and it's easy to sound foolish when trying to talk about a country you don't know much about, or even when you're talking about a country you do know something about. But one thing that I think we learned from the days of early wireless phones was that people, and particularly at the World Bank and other development organizations, were certain that cell phones would just be a toy for the rich in poor countries. They were going to be the only ones who could afford it, and all you needed to have was a few phones, a small network around the capital, and make sure it was compatible with networks in Europe so that they could go travel. And obviously, that proved to be false, and proved that really, really quickly. And in that case, again, broadly, it wasn't a lack of demand, and it wasn't a lack of capital to invest. It was that there had been the various institutions in many countries made it impossible to invest, and the incumbent telephone company, often owned by the government, didn't want entry. But at the time, they decided to allow the entry because they didn't think it was much of a market, and it was so they had to do it to get entry into the WTO, at least back in the 80s. And then before they knew it, poof, there was this, there were multiple networks, and even the poorest people had phones. So sometimes, the answer is it's not, you don't want to look specifically at demand or supply, but what institutions are blocking it in the first place. And of course, now you're talking specifically more about low-income people, and low-income people in poor countries are very, very low income. And that's really a problem that we haven't solved particularly well here either. So.
Thoughts, Ellie or Rosalind, on that topic? So Ellie was waving his hand, so let's start with Ellie.
No, I was going to. Rosalind, Rosalind, go ahead.
Okay. So, the area that I've looked at in depth is, it's had several iterations. It was called internet.org, Facebook Free Basics. Now it's Facebook Discovery. And what I like about this particular program, which again, it's unthinkable we could have it in the United States, but it's been tried in about 60 countries. It's remarkable, where particular content providers have attempted to be very demand focused, to look at a first-time internet user. I think Americans don't appreciate that people in other countries speak languages you can't type into a mobile phone, that the ability of content to be there for people to even understand, why do I need to have it? And what would I do with even issues around, do I have enough electricity? So what I would just offer is, I think the challenge from the US perspective is we have not, the content providers should play a larger role, first of all, to help pay for the infrastructure. That I think would be the first step. But the second step is that if you recognize that if you are more responsive to the needs of the users, you may change your offer, you may subsidize their use, you could give the subsidy to the users directly. But even if you look at what's happened with Facebook itself, with the Discovery, it's a trial beta version, but it's a browser that lets you go to anywhere on the internet through the browser, and it doesn't cost you anything. So this was important for the net neutrality community because they felt the earlier versions were discriminatory. So here is a browser that can take you anywhere. So, you know, but fair enough. But where I think the issue of prioritization comes into play is that if you think about what's socially valuable, it may be healthcare. It may be, you know, I have an AIDS medication. Is it counterfeit? I need to know that. So there are some things that don't take a lot of data that we can supply at a low cost. So we should prioritize health, education, socially valuable services, and things like entertainment. They would be discretionary. We would pay more for them. So this is, again, the notion that comes back to the importance of variable prices, differentiated prices, the ability of different participants to participate in the broadband ecosphere, not that we only put all the cost on consumers, that's all on taxpayers, that all of the players have to participate to make it possible. And I think that's where that's the only way that we close the gaps that are there.
Okay, so beyond subsidies, just there's some changes in the business models that could be helpful. Very good. Ellie, and then I'm going to ask us to wrap up. So Rosalind, I'll start with you after Ellie speaks. I just ask what your closing thoughts are. We'll go Rosalind, Scott, then we'll close with Ellie. So Ellie, what do you have on this topic?
Yeah, I think the internet penetration debate for developing world had always a bit of a kind of World Bank flavor. Like spinach is good for you, so eat it. And the consumers in those countries did not quite see the benefit value proposition for themselves. And so just like Scott mentioned, the cell phones came, and again, the World Bank wasn't there promoting that, it just kind of happened. Then the entertainment part is the driver now. Now that we have established, particularly for the rich country, the online entertainment model, it is providers such as Netflix and YouTube and whatever that will become global, that also for poor countries, in those countries, people will kind of become connected and will pay the monies to get online in order to partake in that worldwide entertainment experience. They have time, they want to watch. The prices have to come down, but then you have scale and network effects as this model increases, spreads, and then you have the ability to have these good services, the e-government and the education and so on, piggyback on entertainment instead of the other way around.
All right, very good. Well, thank you very much. So Rosalind, you and I have talked for hours on these things, so you know I can keep going, but our time is about up. So just what are your concluding thoughts?
Well, so what I would say is, if anything, we need more market development and more technology. I mean, our evolution in the US and the telecommunications space, moving towards 5G, moving to wireless networks, being smarter about how we invest, taking greater advantage of mobile networks, that makes sense. It has made sense before. We have clarified this bipartisan light touch approach in the US. That, if anything, the takeaway from this pandemic is that that was the right approach and we should stay with it.
Okay, thank you. Scott, what are your concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we've seen, like Edward said, networks have performed really well. It's nice that something did well when the whole rest of the world and country are going to hell. So that's nice. But also, like Ellie said, don't waste a crisis. And this has been a huge exogenous shock for all kinds of things, which means that we should be thinking about research questions that we can ask and use what we've seen now as some of the data to test various hypotheses. So I hope graduate students everywhere are thinking about how to answer some of the questions that we've been asking for a long time with what's happened now.
All right. Ellie, concluding thoughts?
Well, I think we've kind of observed that technology wasn't the problem, or that it has come through quite well. Investments have done well. The private sector has done pretty well. But it is institutional constraints that have been in the way of a whole bunch of stuff. And so let's think about it. Policy and other things, not just FCC type policy. And this is an election year. And so maybe TPRC can put together some kind of like a working group or an open seminar series every few weeks in which we discuss a certain, after the election, bipartisan would not be if one wins or the other wins, or what would be a good policy for the country, and have that kind of ready for whoever takes office in January.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. We appreciate your time, your wisdom, the knowledge that you've conveyed. And thank you also to the participants for being here. But I do want to especially thank TPRC. Laura's done a lot of work getting this all together. It's hard to rein in a bunch of academics and scholars. Tough to do. And Nicole for visioning how this could all work. Appreciate that too. So thank you very much. I think there will probably be some sort of a feedback forms, and look for the upcoming panels. I know Scott has one on antitrust issues. I know there's going to be one on education issues as well. Those are going to be, I think, very useful and very exciting to listen to. So thank you all very much for your time. We appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Laura.
My pleasure.